We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Doomberg, head writer for the Doomberg Substack. How are you today? Thanks for joining me.
Tom, great to be back with you. Looking forward to another fantastic discussion. We always have very interesting things to talk about for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, it never seems like there's never a lack of things for you and I to talk about. But at the same time, we're almost privileged to have so many things happen and have so many consequential things to speak about. So obviously, since the last time we spoke, the election is a huge thing that has seemingly shaken things up all over the board. So how, kind of taking a 30,000 foot view, a real step back, do you think this is going to be a very consequential change in the world of macro, in the world of energy policy, in the world of, maybe peace going forward? What do you think are the most important parts to kind of get a good perspective on at this point?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I would say that we are at a very precarious time. We've had the election. Thankfully, there was a definitive outcome. I think a far worse case scenario would have been a legitimately disputed election. There was very little in the way of legitimate evidence that the outcome of the election was consistent with the vote itself. And that's not always the case. And we should begin by being thankful that it was this time. We are seeing, in our view, an unprecedented lame duck session as the Biden administration winds down and the Trump administration spools up. Traditionally, this has been a period of collaboration, perhaps still partisan in nature, and also a period where major, long-lasting geopolitical decisions in particular are put on hold until the new team gets a chance to get in and get its team ready. And in the past several weeks, across many theaters, we are seeing what, at least to sort of a somewhat neutral outside observer, appears to be a purposeful escalation in tensions that seems to be at odds with the president's stated desires during the campaign and what voters ultimately voted for. And that's very dangerous. And one hopes that we can avoid a true escalation into a nuclear conflict, for example. But I would argue, and I think the evidence is difficult for all but the most partisan listeners to ignore, that we are dangerously close to just such an outcome. And the fact that we're doing so during a period where the mental viability of the president is well within bounds to be questioned. I think anybody who has eyes can see the current state of the outgoing president. And then, of course, you and I were talking in the aftermath of the infamous pardon, which Biden announced yesterday, which seems to be the headline du jour. So it's swirling. It's uncertain. Who's actually controlling the White House? Who's pulling the strings behind the scenes is an open question. One that is totally legitimate to debate. And we are crossing red lines that for decades, neither the US nor Russia would have ever dared to do, regardless of your views on the war in Ukraine. Launching US and British-made long-range ballistic missiles into pre-2014 Russia is a red line. And we've had no debate in Congress about declaring war on Russia, but those weapons can't be fired without the direct participation of Western troops. And the Russians have routinely and persistently warned the West that they considered this to be an actual red line. And we just crossed it. And in response, Russia has demonstrated some pretty incredible missile technology and has threatened to continue to escalate. We see a renewed outbreak of hostilities in Syria, and we're seeing, of course, the political unrest in Georgia, which is very reminiscent of what happened in Ukraine in 2014. All these things occurring all at once during the transition are A, probably not a coincidence, and B, very unsettling.
Mm-hmm. Well, unsettling is a true understatement. I think I don't know. I keep trying to sit back and trying to understand what the incentives might be at this point to basically be escalating the war at this point. As you say, it should be a time of transition and maybe putting escalations on the back burner. But it's really unfortunate that we're in this position. And you brought up those two examples. I saw a compilation this morning of the Biden White House saying that they were not going to be pardoning Hunter Biden. And of course, going back on that. And you brought up the other example of Russia as well. And the question I have is, what could happen between now and January or what could the Democrats do between now and January to perhaps derail in some ways the inauguration, or is that a possibility that you see?
Yeah, so to be very clear, President Joe Biden is well within his rights to pardon his son. He will presumably suffer the political consequences and the judgment of history accordingly. That is in a completely separate category to the escalations that you and I had previously discussed. Mm-hmm. I think it was unwise for a variety of reasons for Biden to do that, but I would view that as in a vastly different category than the other things we were discussing. So just to put that
100%,
to one side. The odds of Trump being sworn in on January 20th are effectively close to 1, we hope. One should hope, both sides should hope, because there are no scenarios in which he is not that are pleasant ones. We do note with some interest that he doesn't seem to be straying all that far from Mar-a-Lago in the past few weeks, and one wonders whether he even will before January 20th. And to be fair, there have been at least 2 known attempts on his life, one of which was very narrowly avoided. And if we were in his shoes, Mar-a-Lago seems like a nice enough place. Weather looks pretty good. There's no reason to stray from that bunker, so to speak, because that's effectively what it is. And if you're stationary, the Secret Service is far more effective at, keeping you safe. So the only sort of black swan scenario that one could imagine, which I don't think is a real possibility, is that through these provocations and counter provocations, we end up in a full-blown war and a state of national emergency is declared. And for whatever flimsical justifications are put forward, the current administration decides that they're just not going to turn over power. We would assign that an extremely low probability. I don't think that the U.S. public or even the U.S. institutions, as unified as they are in their support of one side over the other, would tolerate such an outcome. At least I don't want to live in a world where that's possible. And frankly, I don't want to assign such malice to the outgoing Biden administration without a little bit more evidence. But that is the concern that some on the right are expressing as I peruse Twitter and check my right list and my left list and try to get a sense for the truth. But that is the only scenario that I think is on the board. If there are others, we're just not creative enough to come up with them. But it's hard to imagine, absent a full-blown war with a nuclear superpower, that there would be any other scenario to disrupt January 20th. Even if, heaven forbid, a third attempt was successful, it would just mean that J.D. Vance would be sworn in as president, and presumably he would be aware of what Trump campaigned on and what his plans were, because he's actively involved in developing them. But even that would mark a very serious convulsion to the norms of the United States. So we shall see. I think in many ways, the pardon has strengthened Trump and made Trump perhaps better able to execute his admittedly aggressive ambitions in the first 100 days of his new administration.
Mm-hmm. So, Doomberg, if we could, can we talk about the let's say, the appointments to Trump's cabinet. Obviously, there have been some somewhat controversial appointments. And I know you're, kind of a friend of yours, Chris Wright, was nominated for Energy Secretary, which is, shouldn't be at all a surprise, but in some ways is, as I understand it, one of the only people that has ever been nominated to the post that has any actual experience.
Yeah, so the position that matters most to us is Secretary of Energy, and I would sort of recharacterize our relationship with Mr. Wright as a like-minded acquaintance, not quite rising to the level of friend. We were once on a podcast together, and I understand that he occasionally reads our stuff, and in reading his, we find very little to disagree with. So by those measures, we were excited to see his nomination, and his resume is an impressive one, and one that really wasn't a possible candidate on the board for us until we saw his name cross the wires, because we just assumed, who with the level of success and wealth that he has created for himself and his family would want to sacrifice the cauldron, running the cauldron of personal destruction that involves becoming a cabinet nominee. But he is, by outside appearances, a deeply patriotic person and a very pro-human energy enthusiast, and his track record of success across basically everything he's ever tried to do is quite impressive. And so it's encouraging that somebody with his talent and track record is willing to serve in the public's interest in such an important position. And so from that perspective, and of course, we literally wrote a piece called In Praise of Chris Wright, so it's pretty clear where we stood on the nomination. I think that was an outstanding pick, to the extent that other selections by Trump are similarly motivated by competence and track record. We would think that is a good thing. There have certainly been a couple that have been quote unquote controversial, but the media tends to create its own controversies because they have 24 hours to fill. And also one wonders whether Trump hasn't selected a few sort of off the wall picks just to deflect, because there's only so many shots at the targets that the Union Party system in Washington is going to get at his nominees. And so if you pick a few that are obvious for them to range in on, then maybe a few of the more talented and uncontroversial Chris Wrights of the world can get through with much less controversy. I would say that Trump has had 4 years to ponder what went wrong in his first administration and to plan on how to do better. And I would characterize the 2024 transition as being relatively smoother than 2016. After all, you have to remember that we are talking about Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's well put, Doomberg. So considering this, let's say, the attitude of drill baby drill, what are the ramifications of that policy going forward?
So the first level ramification is that such policies will be bullish for energy supplies, which is great, bullish for the economy at large, all things being equal, bearish for energy prices, and bearish for the equities of E&P companies, at least. Increased volume of production is bullish for a certain subset of the energy equity space, namely those companies that profit from increased volume regardless of price. Now, no participant in the energy sector can be agnostic to the price of oil and gas and coal, but there is a subset of companies for whom they are far more insulated from the fluctuations. People that provide services, people that lease land for a royalty, and where their payments are tied to volume and not revenue. Those types of companies look set to do quite well. But the biggest winners, I think, will be those who care about the standard of living of the United States. We are in a position, well, we already are, a global energy gigapower. And if Chris Wright has his way, we see an acceleration of the nuclear renaissance. We see a lightening of federal regulations for the exploration and development of new energy. And all those things are bullish for the American citizen. All things being equal, there's certain, there's always winners and losers in every step change in policy. But the next 4 years could set the country on a course with ramifications for decades. And again, if you had we had initially hoped and publicly advocated for Joe Manchin to be nominated for the position. He's an outgoing Democratic senator, but really a centrist, and he would have presumably sailed through confirmation because the Senate rarely rejects its own. But with Chris Wright being nominated, we were frankly thrilled. So we're quite optimistic about the thing that we care the most about, but we're still cautious and concerned about all the other stuff that you and I have been working our way through.
You and I had a discussion several months ago about basically the politics being the biggest headwind in the way of, more energy or basically peak oil. So do you think that this new administration creates a situation where we're able to look at some of these self-imposed regulations or self-imposed challenges more objectively?
Yeah, let me give just like one small example. We hear from those who should know that one of the day one executive orders of President Trump will be to remove the temporary ban on new LNG export licenses, which will allow a wave of LNG export construction projects to proceed apace. We also suspect that the EPA will be far less intrusive in the development of natural gas power facilities dedicated for data centers and AI development. Both of those things are bullish for domestic natural gas, which is the key constraint. By the way, the consumption of domestic natural gas is the key constraint for the development of growth in oil production in places like the Permian, because they just have too much gas and they don't quite know what to do with it. And so that's just like one small example of one direct action that has a cascading series of effects for the production of more oil and gas. We have long been of the strong belief that the gating function of production in the U.S. is politics and not geology. And I think the next few months and quarters and years are going to prove that out. Already, spot prices of natural gas in the Waha hub, which is in the heart of the Permian, are well above zero again. They had spent much of the year fluctuating around and under zero, where people literally were paying others to remove their natural gas, and that has finally abated for a variety of reasons, not just politics, but also a new pipeline has come online that is allowing for significant offtake capacity and so on. These arbitrages eventually close, but once you have a home for your natural gas, then you can produce more oil. Right now, we are capped by the gas-oil ratio that we're experiencing in places like the Permian. And so the new incoming nominee for the Secretary of Treasury has announced an intent to facilitate an incremental 3 million barrels of oil production in the U.S. during his tenure. There's a unified desire amongst the incoming Trump appointees to unleash American ingenuity and technical prowess in the energy sector, and I think we're going to see that. Mm-hmm.
So does that end up creating a situation where, we have an abundance of energy, and again, we're realistically looking at the challenges that the US faces as a country, maybe particularly like the energy grid challenges or issues that need to be addressed?
Yeah, I think another pillar of Trump's energy strategy is a deconstruction of the Inflation Reduction Act and a redirection of some of that money to what he calls "quote unquote" real infrastructure. I listened to a comment he made in that regard a few days ago with some interest. We believe that the Trump victory is a death knell to the ESG movement. We made a call after COP28 last year that would in fact be recorded by historians as peak ESG, and I think that call has largely played out. Mm-hmm. COP29 was a flop. I mean, nobody went. Nothing meaningful happened. And the U.S. is going to pull back from its carbon commitments. China never had carbon commitments and doesn't really care about carbon emissions. The data just proves it out. Mm-hmm. And Trump's number one economic objective is to become more competitive with China. And he's not going to allow the U.S. to go into that fight with one hand tied behind its back. And so I don't think the market has fully priced in what it means, but we think that there's going to be a stampede to the exit. I mean, we've said several times that if you really put some truth serum into the vast majority of executives of manufacturing companies and energy companies, and chemical companies, most of them never really thought that climate change was the existential threat that they were instructed to say it was. Mm-hmm. And being liberated to speak. One of the rare exceptions, of course, was Chris Wright himself in a 180-page document he published as a public company CEO when it wasn't exactly safe to do so, called Bettering Human Lives, I believe. Most CEOs were happy to, go along to get along and mouthed what they were supposed to say and paid for fancy booths at various COP meetings. With Trump normalizing the vocalization of skepticism and opposition to these trends, we're going to see a stampede to the exit. And in fact, it'll be a competitive disadvantage if you don't. Mm-hmm. And so, we think this is the end of all of that stuff.
Well, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is some of these voices that have the courage to actually speak up in a respectful, not only a respectful, but also an important way against what the narrative is. And I think that's so important. And I mean, obviously that has been really, really important over the last 4 years. Obviously, I think with a pendulum swing, let's say back to the right or hopefully back to the center at very least, that's going to become less crazy sounding in those ways. But for those of our listeners that maybe really took that narrative, do you have any resources that you've found that explain, let's say, the climate change narrative in a more useful and objective way, or the carbon emissions narrative?
Well, I can only really explain how we explained it, which is, in our view, it doesn't matter if it's real or not, because the planet is the occupants of this planet are not going to do anything about it. Any energy not consumed by the West is going to be greedily and happily consumed by the 7 billion people who live at a fraction of our current lifestyles. Mm-hmm. Your lifestyle is mandated and fixed by how much energy you get to harness and to deploy for the purposes of bettering your life. All humans everywhere want a higher standard of living. And so when I debated people like Professor Steve Keen, for example, our answer was brace for impact. Like, we are going to run the experiment. So we'll find out which side was correct. And if it is as catastrophic as you're saying it's going to be, I guess we'll just have to deal with the consequences to such calamities as they arise, because that is what's going to happen. It was never going to be the case that China and India and Brazil and Indonesia and Pakistan and Africa were going to buy into the prospect of continuing to keep the plight of their average citizen in the impoverished category when there was an opportunity to do something about it. And the opportunity that's presented by Europe foregoing the consumption of oil, gas, and coal is that same oil, gas, and coal is going to be available to those countries at a moderately cheaper price because there's slightly less demand for it. The gating function of demand for fossil fuels is production. And unless and until we impose limits on production, which, by the way, since most of the resources in the world are in countries that don't really buy into the climate change narrative anyway, that's just not going to happen. So, for example, for all of its virtue strutting, Europe produces practically no oil and practically no natural gas and a bit of coal. The coal is burned in places like Germany and Poland today. What does how much oil or gas Europe consumes have to do with the rest of the world as it pertains to how much oil and gas will be consumed by the rest of the world? Nothing, because they don't produce any of it. So if they don't burn it, it just makes it available for somebody else, and they will burn it. We've formulated this last year in what we call Doomberg's postulate. Like, every molecule of fossil fuel produced will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions against such activities merely relocate who gets to enjoy the privilege. Indonesia and the people in Indonesia would love to drive a car. and they would love to be able to afford cheap gasoline to power that car. And they buy used cars from the Western countries and keep them alive as long as possible. And if gasoline is going to be more available because we in the West have decided to power our cars with batteries, well, fine. They'll happily take that gasoline and burn it as long as it's produced. And so the gating function of demand is production. There are cycles, and sometimes it's overproduced in some parts of the world where there aren't enough engines in other parts of the world to take advantage of those cheap prices. But those are the classic arbitrage flows that always get closed. We're in the middle of a giant one right now, which is the arbitrage closing between natural gas and oil, as we switch the engines or manipulate the molecules to make the most use out of the energy embodied in those hydrocarbons. But if you take a step back and you plot a 50-year chart of the global demand for energy, it's an upward sloping line with a slight sinusoidal wave. And the reason why there is a wave at all is because there is a sort of phase mismatch between the capital investment cycle in the energy sector and the broader business cycle. And so sometimes things get temporarily out of whack. But betting on that line continuing to go up and to the right is the single strongest bet one can make. Mm-hmm. And shorting it is a foolish trade.
Mm-hmm. Trump recently said, and this, I want to get back to your point about trying to make the U.S. more competitive on the world stage. But he said that he would recently be imposing 100% tariffs on countries that are looking to abandon using the U.S. dollar. So what do you think of this? And what leg does he have to stand on to threaten?
So Trump is an interesting character. I mean, I think you have to observe what he says and what he does through atypical lenses. So let's talk about a story that might be closer to your direct domain. He tweeted about imposing tariffs on Canada and Mexico, specifically about the fentanyl crisis and a few other beefs that he has with both countries. And I think, by the way, he has been stone cold right on fentanyl. And it's long past time that somebody of his stature elevates the issue and pledges to do something about it. Mm-hmm. I would note, to his credit, which is not a person we have generally given a lot of credit to, Justin Trudeau calmly got on a plane, spent the night at Mar-a-Lago, had what seems to be relatively productive conversations with the incoming president-elect, and we would fade the prospect of the fourth largest country-to-country trading relationships suddenly being subjected to an overnight 25% tariff across the board. Mm-hmm. So Trump's style is, in sort of classic negotiation strategy, is to A, always open, and B, always open with a relatively ridiculous position. His opening stance is more of a statement of intent and a statement of a desire for change than it is a policy proposal. And I would view the BRICS tweet, which came on the heels of the Canada-Mexico tariff tweet, in the same vein. Mm-hmm. The U.S. is not capable of applying 100% tariffs on the imports of many of these countries because we're as dependent on them. And when I say we, I live in the U.S. So mm-hmm. the U.S. is as dependent on them as the sending companies are dependent on the U.S. dollars they get in exchange for participating in the markets. So I would view that as an opening gambit. And there'll be two types of quote unquote aspiring BRICS countries, those that do a Justin Trudeau and those that do a Vladimir Putin. And then we'll see what happens. And but in the end, I mean, in the long run, we would point out that it's not like the BRICS countries woke up one day and decided to stop using the US dollar for no reason. I think a lot of this flows from the weaponization of the US dollar and the imposition of sanctions across dozens of countries and specific companies and individuals in a way that makes it all but impossible for those countries and companies and individuals to do business in the US dollar system. And it's not as though they're just going to stop trying to do business. And to the extent that other countries are worried about someday being put on that list, it's only natural that they would at least look to hedge their bets or buy a little insurance against such eventualities. And so the U.S. itself is at least partially to blame for the accelerated development of the BRICS option. And so I think it's not just a one-way street. But again, when we view a tweet like that from Trump, we take it seriously, but not literally. And I think it's almost a cliche thing to say at this point, but it's a mental framework that has worked quite well since 2015.
I've heard that before, and I don't know if you said it or who said it on a podcast, but I think that's entirely correct to view that. But you made the distinction about doing a Justin Trudeau versus doing a Vladimir Putin. What do you mean by that?
Well, as I said, I give Trudeau credit. He recognizes the importance of the U.S. relationship. Mm-hmm. He recognizes the importance of Donald Trump in the current political dynamic. And he recognized the value of discourse, especially peer-to-peer, in-person discourse. And he himself, of course, is in the middle of a very hotly contested campaign, even though it's not officially launched yet. Everybody knows what's coming and looks set to lose that by a wide margin. And there was a world in which he could have taken a different position with Trump and sort of prioritized his prospects in the upcoming election as opposed to protecting the well-being and economic health of the companies and citizens of Canada. And he seems to have chosen the second option, which he should get credit for. He could have made Trump the enemy and ran against that, and it might have injected some much-needed energy into his prospects to retain his position as prime minister. But instead of that, he took what I believe is the more prudent approach, which is, as I said, to get on a plane and risk being called, submitting to Trump's whims or kissing Trump's hand or bending the knee to Trump. And all of those things all of those accusations will be thrown his way. But if I were an exporter of goods operating in Canada and the U.S. was an important market to me, I would be relatively happy that Justin Trudeau did what he did. And then whatever your views of the man or your views of his politics, and we certainly disagree with him on many things, I think if you're not capable of giving credit where credit is due, then you're not really sincere.
Yeah, that's again, an excellent way to put that. But why did you contrast that with what Putin did?
Well, Putin is actively working to create the alternative to the U.S. dollar that Trump was bemoaning about in his tweet. And again, Putin he would argue he wasn't left with much in the way of a choice. Mm-hmm. But Putin is currently basically at war with the United States, which gets back to the first thing we talked about. Mm-hmm. And Trudeau didn't want a war with the United States. And so, war is always the ultimate failure of diplomacy. Mm-hmm. And both parties in a war have, by definition, failed in their diplomacy. And Trudeau seems to have nipped this one in the bud. And kudos for him for doing it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, Doomberg, in that vein, what do you think the possibilities are of Trump coming into office and actually negotiating some type of a ceasefire or peace on the Ukraine front?
It's hard to say. Much can change between now and January 20th, as we talked about. Also, I do think that Trump has a tendency to overestimate his hands and to underestimate the realities on the ground. And having seen at least leaked summaries of what his plans are for a negotiated peace, they don't strike me as rather realistic. And so, but again, who knows where we'll be on January 20th? Who knows where the line of combat contact will be? Who knows what will have transpired between now and then and how the realities on the ground will change. We've long argued that how NATO loses this war is a very dangerous moment. And to the extent that Biden is trying to box Trump in, he might be successful in that regard. We would say that the prospects for peace are less than 50-50. I think we're going to see a military solution on the ground. And whether or not that leads to escalation, of course, is a risk. Mm-hmm. But my sense in having read Russian internal propaganda and Ukrainian internal propaganda and Chinese internal propaganda. The warring sides, and of course, U.S. propaganda, which is by definition the mainstream media, the sides are miles apart, almost to the point of delusion. And ultimately, might is right. And Russia has a bigger army and a more sophisticated supply chain and is much closer to the line of combat contact than the NATO countries supplying Ukraine. And so a deal, if it can't be struck, then everyone just watches and sees what happens on the ground. Now, this is why we're seeing, I believe, it's not coincidental, we're seeing flare-ups in various other parts of the world where Russia has some national interest, and probably under the hopes that this causes a diversion of resources and mind share away from Ukraine, or sets up negotiating sort of chips to be used in some future summit. I would be encouraged if we saw a summit between Trump and Putin early on in the Trump administration. I don't think that's out of the question. But there's the sort of an escalation on the board that others have pointed out, which is this Transnistria, this territory, sort of quasi-Russian territory next to Moldova, which is also bordering Ukraine. There's some rumors floating about in the sort of corners of the internet where you get to read Russian propaganda that the Ukrainians are going to make a move on this territory. And so if that happens, that would be yet another move on the chessboard that changes the dynamics of whether or not Trump and Putin can reach a negotiated peace post January 20th.
Do we have any, positive developments in the way of the Middle Eastern conflict as well, Doomberg?
Yeah, I would say, of course, we were happy to see a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, however temporary it might be. But, literally the next day, we saw this flare up in Syria. And so one wonders whether the two events were truly disconnected. I mean, I long ago dropped any pretenses that events like these are random, right? I mean, there's a broader game being played by people you and I never see or hear from. And there's always, whenever I see things that I don't understand, I now assume that I'm just missing an important piece of information. And so the price of oil would indicate that the market believes that troubles in the Middle East will be basically contained. And I hope they're right.
So, Doomberg, I've heard you talk a lot about, let's say, the different pieces of this possible upcoming administration. How effective do you think Elon Musk and Vivek are going to be to really accomplish a lot with the DOGE, the government efficiency portion of that puzzle?
I'm a little puzzled by the whole thing, to borrow your word. It's not a government position officially. I suppose it advises the Office of Budget Management, or a Budget Management Office. And firing a federal employee is notoriously one of the hardest things to do. And but having said that, I mean, constitutionally, the administrative state is an extension of the president. That's pretty clear. And from what I've read, it's not my area of expertise. There are some things that Trump could do if so advised by Elon Musk and Vivek, but I don't think the two of them have much in the way of authority to do anything other than advise the cabinet members who oversee those parts of the federal government and ultimately the president himself. So what they find and what Trump feels he can act on politically. And then there's always the question of what has to get through Congress to enact meaningful change. And I would argue that it's wrong to view Washington as the Republicans, i.e. Trump, have control of the House and the Senate and the White House and the Supreme Court. Trump has control of the White House and the Uniparty controls Congress. And if you have any doubt about that, just observe what Mitch McConnell's been up to for the past couple of weeks. I think it's wrong to view Republicans and Democrats as two separate teams. I think there's Washington, which voted 96% Democrat, I believe, and Trump. And especially as closely divided as the House is, it won't take much in the way of defections for Congress to gum up the system. And by the way, that's the way the Constitution was written and what it was intended, and we have who we have as members of Congress. Although I would argue Congress's popularity and Congress's reelection rates are two vastly different numbers, which is testimony to the obscene jerry-rigging that we've seen across the country, both Republican and Democrat, to assure that incumbents are all but certain to get elected, except maybe at the margin. So the Republicans, quote unquote, don't exist anymore. I think there are people that are aligned with Trump's interests and people that are aligned with the continuation of how Washington has always been run. And that second group is as bipartisan as it gets. And that's why I think you're seeing former Democrats in Trump's cabinet as nominees, and then a bunch of people that aren't associated with the traditional Republican Party, and very few nominees who are associated with the traditional Republican Party. I would guarantee you that Mitch McConnell views himself as a member of the Trump opposition in Washington, and he probably has, being a relatively parliamentarian that he is. I'm sure he has 3 like-minded friends locked up as a quote-unquote blocking minority, and is more than prepared to make Trump's life difficult during the first few months of his administration.
Mm-hmm. That being said, do you think that he's, this existential threat that some people say that he is to the deep state and the swamp, as it were?
Yeah, absolutely. You can only, if you want an indication of what the deep state or the swamp, as you characterize it, is thinking, just look at what John Bolton is saying on TV. Right? I mean, he's the embodiment of the deep state, of the uniparty. And there is panic, but I wouldn't underestimate the power of the deep state to fight back, and nor the motivation to do so. So again, there's lots of risks between now and January 20th, and between January 20th and the first 100 days. And then, 4 years is a long time as well. So we'll see how much Trump can get done through executive action, which is a lot. We've long warned those on the left who basically prefer to use executive action as a means of imposing policy, that if you lose control of the executive wing, you stand susceptible to the exact same escalations in reverse. And we're going to see that now. The whirlwind, reaping what you sow and all of that. And Trump, having learned from the fiasco really of his first transition, is far more motivated and far more effective at playing this particular game. And I do think that the Hunter Biden pardon, whatever your views on it, does strengthen Trump's hand in this regard.
Mm-hmm. So Doomberg, obviously, the election had a major shock for the markets as well, or not necessarily a shock, but a kind of a step change in some of the assets that we all pay attention to. So do you think the market is getting ahead of itself, and what pieces of it do you think are going to, kind of have a reality check?
Well, first of all, far be it from me to question the wisdom and judgment of the markets. Having been burned by such fantasies in the past, we have a deep respect for what the price action is telling us. And the price action, Bitcoin and so on, Nvidia, oil, Tesla, is telling us that the market believes that Trump is going to be president, and that Trump is going to do many of the things that he has promised to do. And for the companies that the market is, and commodities that the markets are currently repricing, the prospect of Trump not becoming president has all but been written out. And the prospect of him not being able to achieve at least a fair bit of his proposed agenda is also kind of been minimized. I'm very interested by the development of the betting markets, by the way. I mean, I think this is it's certainly been a noted phenomenon, but probably underreported, given the relative success these markets have had in predicting events. Although I would say that market participants failed to get the Hunter Biden pardon right, because I saw it went from like a low 20% chance to basically 100 in a matter of hours. But it's an interesting additional source of data that didn't exist before. Mm-hmm. It existed, but not at this scale. But yeah, I think the markets are always telling you something interesting, and you should note it. And then, as for if they're getting ahead of themselves, again, the next 60 days or however many days we have left between now and January 20th, I guess it's more like 50 days, are going to be absolutely fascinating. The one market indicator that we think might be underpriced is the VIX indicator. Market volatility is anticipating a period of relative calm, which again, we respect the markets and we hope that that's correct. But if you ask me to pick one that seemed underpriced, it would be the VIX.
Mm-hmm. Gold came off somewhere around $200, and it really took the wind out of the sails for a lot of people within that market. Do you think that any of the fundamental picture for gold has actually changed?
Oh, sure. Yeah. The US dollar's gotten really strong. And Trump has decided he's going to pick a fight with BRICS. And a fundamental underpinning of the rally in gold is the anticipation that the BRICS currency project would develop and gold would play a key role in it. And but having said that, we've not changed our allocation towards gold. We took a little bit off near the top, which I think is always prudent. Nobody goes broke banking a profit. But we still have a very large position, and the long-term thesis for gold remains unchanged. The U.S. is debasing the currency. Trump is likely to accelerate that. Other countries are going to want to shift away from U.S. treasuries as a neutral reserve asset. Gold is the only really viable substitution for those. Nobody's going to accept Chinese debt or Russian debt or Brazilian debt or Indian debt as a reserve asset. And so it's treasuries or bust. And we're still adding a trillion and change in debt every 100 days, and we're crossing 1.2 trillion in interest rate payments a year. And the long bond is telling you that there's trouble ahead. And so, yes, there's a real and tangible reason why gold traded off $200. By the way, it was up a straight line for the last 18 months. Like it's okay to have a healthy pullback and some consolidation. Things don't go up forever. Icarus comes back to earth. And look, Trump's tweet on Sunday validated the market's reaction.
You mentioned earlier the kind of service sector businesses within the oil and gas sector. And of course, the gold miners have really not participated to the extent that most would have expected. Do you think that there is some type of a disconnect there, or that the markets are as wise as they need to be in that sector?
Gold miners are just the hated class companies. There's just no other way to say it. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of shenanigans in this space. Frankly, there's a lot of fraud in this space. And partitioning the good management teams from the bad ones is challenging. And partitioning the high quality assets from the low quality ones is challenging. But for whatever reason, the market has just decided that as a class, they're not interested in gold miners. Now, to the individual investor, that provides an opportunity for alpha. If you're willing and able to do your own research and to truly discover the good teams with the good assets that care about their shareholders. But the market is not going to reward you. At least there's no evidence that the market is going to reward you. You'll have to be rewarded in dividends or buyouts or liquidity events. And so in my mind, like, I don't even know why a gold mining company would want to be public, raise money in the private markets, have a little bit more patient shareholder deck, and only really come to markets when you've proven it. But it is just a hated class. And if you just look at the disparity in appreciation between gold and the gold mining stocks, it's pretty clear. If you would have told me that gold would breach, $2,700 an ounce, I would have said that would be wildly bullish for gold mining stocks because, and especially in an era where diesel prices are falling and natural gas is basically free, the market is just mispricing the gold miners. And so to the contrarians, to the value oriented, that's an opportunity. And to those people, I would say, prepare to be patient.
You were looking forward from here. I've heard you talk about what the U.S. can still dominate in. So what are those two sectors and what are their importance to the U.S. going forward?
Yeah, primary energy and artificial intelligence are two areas where the U.S. has really significant global advantages. And also the two are interconnected. You need an enormous amount of primary energy to be an effective AI leader. China is getting quite good at AI technologies, but they're short energy and they don't have near the resources that we do. And by the way, those two things are ample pillars for a manufacturing renaissance, which we know is very high on Trump's agenda, which is why he's talking about tariffs and so on, because he wants to bring manufacturing back to the US. And so you have the combination of cheap energy, world-leading AI technology. I mean, there's just no question that the US is at the cutting edge of all of this. And a president who is keenly interested on both accelerating those two advantages and taking full sort of economic advantages of those strengths. And so by those measures, we should be hopeful. But at the same time, like the DOGE question you asked earlier, cutting the government to the extent that is being talked about will trigger a recession. And is Trump prepared to suffer through that? He's a person who likes to see numbers go up. And when I say that, people are a little surprised. But look, excess fiscal spending is a tailwind for economic growth, at least temporarily. It's a sugar high and eventually collapses. And the incremental growth per debt shrinks and all of those things. But if you substantially cut government spending, at least in the short term, you risk triggering a recession. And one wonders whether Trump has the political fortitude to accept that, to make the long-range bet on the rebirth that will come from the recession. By the way, we're not anti-recession. I think one of the big fallacies of central planning and the federal central banks and global central banks and so on is that recessions are to be avoided. You should try to cushion the blow for those most impacted, but ultimately creative destruction is real. And if you postpone the natural forces of the business cycle, then when you do have a crisis, it tends to be deeper and to go on for longer. And so it's not clear to me that preventing recessions is net beneficial well, first of all, you can't do it, but attempting to prevent recessions is almost never beneficial. And the whole interference with the economic cycle altogether is a bipartisan thing, and it is a global thing. All central bankers are trying to do it, and we think it's a mistake.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had a great conversation with Kevin Muir the other day about, exactly as you're talking about. There's two sides to what Trump is saying. He wants to see basically two things that can't happen at the same time, right? If he wants to see the number go up, obviously on the election, the dollar shot up and strengthened quite a bit. Yet to improve competitiveness and exports, you're going to need a weaker dollar. So, talking about both of those things and actually trying to understand the reality of both of those situations is kind of back to that saying of literally versus pragmatically, right?
Yeah, no, that's just one of many walking contradictions that is Donald Trump. And look, you can't deny that he is a historic force, right? I mean, and his odyssey from the escalator in 2015 to 2020 to what just transpired is truly the stuff of history. And historians will be writing and thinking and pontificating about it for a very long time. But you're right. Like you can't. And by the way, just as we're talking, a headline just crossed Bloomberg that Israel is now bombing Lebanon again. So, this bluster that peace will happen on day one and the war will be over, again, is just not consistent with the realities on the ground. But at the same time, the intent is there, and there is a Trump effect, and we do see the Justin Trudeau's getting on a plane and so on. And so, but even Trump is not a magician central planner. There's no such thing. Like, ultimately, free markets prevail. Now, to the extent that DOGE is successful in their efforts to cut regulations, that's different than cutting costs, by the way. That could actually be a meaningful contribution from the DOGE or whatever DOGE is. But to your question about the inherent contradictions in Trump's many political pontifications, they're real. They're there. They were there in his first administration. Fed independence to berating Chairman Powell and so on. So this will happen again. I mean, Trump is Trump. He is who he is. We all know who he is. We we know who he isn't, by the way, which made some of the attacks against him in this election, I think, rather foolish.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, Trump is Trump, and Trump's going to Trump. Trump likes his numbers to go up. Trump likes to win. Trump wants more manufacturing. Trump wants America to be Hulk Hogan again, and he's going to try to do it.
Absolutely, he does. Doomberg, as we wrap up here, is there anything that you'd like our listeners to think about? Let's say going into the end of the year here or before the inauguration?
Yeah, I would just keep a close eye on political developments in Washington, and whether there is, in fact, as smooth a transition as the market is currently pricing in. We remain hopeful but skeptical, but we're also just keeping a close eye. And also keep an eye on potential other points of escalation around the world. I mean, I've looked, all the other countries involved were already in World War III. We don't characterize it as such in North America, but that's certainly how the rest of the world sees it. And there's a lot of hope in the rest of the world that Trump suddenly is going to change all of that. We hope he does. We're not convinced that he will. But I would say, as cliche as it sounds, I pray for peace. I certainly pray for peace. I don't, I'm the parent of military eligible draftees. The prospect of seeing my son going off to war is not one that I relish. I think I'm unabashedly isolationist. I mean, I think the Department of Defense should be focused on defending. That position is not necessarily a majority view. But in my worldview, we should have a declaration of war with Congress if we're going to send combat troops on serious missions. And we haven't done that since 9/11. So it's a dangerous time. It's a cautionary time, but also potentially hopeful time. And so let's hope for the best outcome.
Cautious optimism and, let's say, focusing on finding reasonable solutions. I think that's a safe bet.
And risk management. Yeah.
Excellent. Doomberg, as always, excellent conversation. I really appreciate your time. Of course, our listeners can find more on your very well written, very well researched Substack, doomberg.substack.com. Doomberg, thank you again so much.
Thanks, Tom. Always a pleasure. And looking forward to the next time, and have a wonderful Christmas and New Year and the rest of that jazz.
Thank you. You as well. This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.